As a victim services worker, we need to consider some issues and concerns when working with older adults. Older adults who experience abuse often deal with feelings of disappointment that could lead to depression and a sense of helplessness and loss of control. In addition, the natural process of aging raises its own challenges, such as decline in mobility, visual and cognitive capacities, and memory loss, increasing dependence on others, altered state due to medication which can be mistaken for permanent lack of competence, unfamiliar technological advances, and ageist attitudes from family members and society at large. When an older adult is considering options to stop the abuse, they recognize and are concerned about the complex repercussions. It is important to recognize that the abuser may be providing critical supports and companionship to the older adult. The victim service worker can go over the options and point out what supports could be put in place. For example, access to additional benefits such as home and community health care programs, community services for socialization, delivery of groceries and meals, friendly visitor programs. When the abuser is a family member, caregiver, or friend, the older adult may often choose to put up with the abuse so that the family can stay together. There is also shame, breach of trust. They may be blamed for the abuse by other family members or their cultural group, blamed for not taking action to stop the abuse, and they often question their parenting of the abuser. This is further complicated when there is undiagnosed mental illness and concurrent disorders. The older generation we are dealing with now experienced a time when mental illness was not understood as it is today, and were often blamed for the behaviors which we now know are attributable to mental illness. This attitude prevails if the older adult is not informed of the advances in the field of mental illness and substance abuse. This is a very important role for the victim service worker. A similar attitude exists for domestic violence, which often has become a way of life and is perpetrated by the next generation who are now abusing the older adult. Older adults who decide to leave abusive relationships after many years of living in an intimate relationship with an abuser or an abusive family member often have to deal with changes in their living accommodations and personal situations that can be extremely challenging and would need supports. Typically, they have to move to a new community, lose their network of friends, and most often face financial hardship. Mortality and depression become a greater issue. It is also important to remember that children may be present in the abusive situation. The older adult could be raising grandchildren, and they would have to be considered when planning for safety. As a victim service worker providing emotional support, it is essential to acknowledge all the dynamics that the older adult is facing, especially when they prefer not to access the justice and legal system to end the abuse. It is important to consider the situation from the older adult's perspective, empathize and offer supports and options in a manner that allows the older adult to participate and make decisions in their best interest. Building trust in the relationship gives the older adult the freedom to express exactly how they are feeling because they are not being judged. Safety planning with older adults requires extra attention. For the older generation, the language of abuse may not be very familiar. Abuse may have been ignored, tolerated, or not talked about in their generation. It may take time to help the older adult recognize that they have established coping mechanisms and how these can be used for future safety planning. It is important to ensure that the older adult is physically able to follow through with a plan. For example, is the older adult able to get to the phone? Do they remember their address, etc.? Taking more time to go over the details and ensuring that each step is practical is important. It may be necessary to update the safety plan more often if declining health and cognitive capacities are issues to be considered. Providing victim services over the phone can be beneficial for older adults as it provides them an opportunity to speak to a non-judgmental and supportive third party, which is the victim service worker, who can provide a place for the older adult to speak without censoring their thoughts. This can be cathartic for the older adult. It makes access to services much easier as long as the older adult does not live with the abuser. Providing services over the phone can be challenging for the victim services worker. There are no visual cues or non-verbal relationship building. Providing silent spaces in the conversation, attention to intonation and language all play a role. If you're not sure of anything, just ask. If the older adult becomes very distressed, there are some methods that may calm the older adult, such as going to get a drink, rubbing their feet on the floor, or standing up. Allow more time for safety planning to ensure details are covered. However, phone services may not be appropriate for older adults who have hearing difficulties or hearing loss. Care and communicating information for older adults who have hearing difficulties are extremely important, particularly in safety planning.